Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Hullabaloo with Miss Beth here at Lamb Library. Today, we are going to be talking all about the Middle Ages. Do you have any idea when that time period was? Well, it was a long, long time ago. It's even hard to imagine how long ago it was. So, what year are we in right now? Can you think? 2020, right? So, if you count back hundreds of years, yes, hundreds, the Middle Ages were between the years of 500 and 1500. So that was almost 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago. That is quite a long time. And we like to call them the Middle Ages because they fell between two different other time periods that you may have heard of already, which was the Roman time period and the Renaissance. And then here was the Middle Ages right in between. And it was a very, very different time period back then. People dressed in different clothes and lived in different kinds of houses and ate different kinds of food that was all very different from what we know and like today. There were no computers or cars or planes or anything like that, any of our modern technology. So it might take a little bit of time to get used to. So you probably noticed that I have a very interesting looking outfit on here. And this is a typical dress from the Middle Ages. It was kind of plain, a solid color, unless you were very, very rich, which meant that you could afford to buy more colorful clothing. In the Middle Ages, people wore lots of different heavy layers of cloth. And the more layers that you had, that meant the richer that you were. And usually you would wear an underdress underneath your other dress like this. But I didn't wear one today because I wanted to show you what it looked like. And it's just a very typical white linen dress. And on your head, you would probably have some sort of head covering. If you're a woman, it would just be a simple head covering like this. Or if you're a man, it would be some sort of fancy hat. And I also have my leather belt here. That is kind of like an accessory, kind of like a fashion item, but it's also very practical because it keeps everything tucked in. And they also would hook some pouches on their belts here to carry around all their different things that they needed. Probably not cell phones or anything like that, but their tools, like a little bit of knives or anything like that that they might need to carry around. So those would be attached to their belts. So there were many different kinds of people who lived back in the Middle Ages. There were the farmers and the people who built the houses and the castles and the churches. And there were craftsmen who were people who had different kinds of skills in different areas, building pottery or blacksmithing or anything like that. And all of these people made up what we call the peasantry, which were the lower class people who didn't have a lot of money. They worked very hard for what they made. And they sometimes farmed the land, even though they didn't own it. And they had to get all of their food from that land that they farmed. And their bosses, so to say, were the lords and the barons who ruled over them and owned that land. And they had a little bit more money than the peasants. And of course, at the very top, you had the kings and queens that ruled over different areas of the world back then. So I have a few different voices to read about from the Middle Ages. And they're from all different parts of society. A lot of them are younger in this book. So I really want you to pay attention to the words they use and how they talk and what they talk about. And it's very different from our language nowadays, but it will kind of give you an idea of how they talked and what they lived back then. So this is called Good Masters, Sweet Ladies, Voices from a Medieval Village by Laura Amy Schlitz and illustrated by Robert Bird and read with permission of Candlewick Press. So our very first voice that you're going to hear from is Taggart, the blacksmith's daughter. So blacksmiths back then were probably of the lower class. They didn't make a lot of money and they didn't own very much land. And blacksmiths were the people who made horseshoes and anything that had to do with metal. That's what they worked in. So the blacksmith's daughter would have been learning this same trade from her father. So let's see what she has to say. 9 days it's been since the Maying. And we have a little note over here that says May Day, which is what she means when she says Maying, was an important medieval holiday. People celebrated by gathering flowers, dancing, and playing games. So it's been 9 days since the May Day, and I am restless yet. Mother hasn't seen it, nor father nor Robin. Only the horses know. It was May Day, and the others, even father and mother at their age, set off for the woods, wanting bluebells and cowslips, and kissing and hugging under the trees. I used to go. When I was little, I liked to pick flowers and peek, but I'm older now. My friends all have sweethearts, but there's no one for me. And I know why. I'm too big, father says. His father was a giant of a man, and somehow his size came down to me. There's something else. I've stared into the round pool, and it's hard to tell. The water's never still. So when she says she stared into the round pool, that's because they didn't have very many mirrors back then. So she literally had to look into a pool or a pond to be able to see what she looked like, her reflection. But I think I don't look very good. Big and ugly, and shy in the bargain. Mother says I'll likely not marry at all. How very sad. It's a world of trouble you'll save yourself, says mother. And no doubt she's right. My fine big girl, that's father. He taught me the work of the forge, which is the blacksmith. And even Robin admits there's no one better to quiet a horse than me. I lay my big hands on them and feel them trembling. I know how they feel. They're like me, big and timid. So I breathe sweet peace to them, not with my lips, but through my fingers, and they hear me, not with their ears, but through their skins. The others went a maying, and I stayed behind, spinning in the sunshine. The morn was clear as glass, and I was happy as a singing bird. And then he came, leading his horse, and the horse was limping, head down, as fine as a horse as I've ever seen. A fair gray palfrey, a wondrous horse. But I was gazing at the boy, too. He had brown hair, not golden like the knights in stories, and his eyes were dark as rivers. The glory was his face, the shape of it, I don't have the words. He wore a blue cloak, bluer than the sky, and in the clasp was a sprig of white hawthorn. He'd been a Maying, and how I disliked the girl he might have kissed. I was ashamed to be caught staring, but I put my hands on the palfrey, his horse, and he gentled, as they always do. I ran my hand down the lame leg and picked up the hoof and saw a stone caught between the hoof and the shoe. A very sad thing. Is the blacksmith in? His voice was like his face, proud and courteous. My palms were sweating. I can ease him. So I led the horse to the forge, and the master followed. I could tell right away that he loved his horse very much. I don't know what he thought, that a maid should know how to shoe a horse. He may have been startled. I didn't dare look. It says most blacksmiths were men. However, a surprising number of medieval wives and daughters learned this trade, such as the art of the forge. And that is exactly what Taggart is doing, learning the trade of the blacksmith. I set to work and my hands were steady. All the time I was fishing for something to say. A fine morning, or even, what's your name? But I knew who he was, Sir Stephen's nephew, Hugo they call him. He hunts in these woods. I never did speak. I thought if I opened my mouth, he'd know my whole heart and how I felt. So when I finished, I wiped my hands on my apron and held out a coin, a farthing. And he held out a coin. It was a farthing, which was only 1/4 of a cent, but it actually was a lot of money back then. I was suddenly bold, and I reached out my hand and shoved it away. And then my face got very hot. I could almost hear Robin. Taggart's blushing, look at Taggart, Taggart's red. I turned and ran back to the house and crouched down with my back to the door. I hid my face in my hands. I don't know why or for how long. Afterward, I went outside, back to the forge. Hugo was gone by then, long gone. And it seems a long life. I may live 50 years and not see him again. Not close, not to speak to. There's a good smith up the castle. Thinking that, I bent my head and saw, lying on the anvil, a miracle. That sprig of hawthorn from his cloak lying there right on the anvil. If 'twere on the ground it might only have fallen, but it was on the anvil. I picked it up, and I couldn't stop smiling because I knew that he had left it for me. So that's a very sweet ending to Taggart's story. And she was very sad throughout the story because she thought that she didn't fit in, that she was learning a trade that girls don't usually learn, and that she was big and ugly. But really, she learned in the end that she was just as beautiful as any of the other girls, and that learning the blacksmith trade was just as acceptable. And even Hugo, who was much higher in society than she was, he was a lord's son or a lord's nephew, even thought that she was worthy of his attention. So that was a very good ending to that story. Now let's hear another voice, and this is Isabelle, the lord's daughter. And you'll hear in this story how Isabelle comes from a very rich family, and some of the others in town don't like that very much, and she doesn't understand why. So maybe we can hear a little bit of what she has to say here. I cannot get the stain out of my gown. I have tried chicken feathers and water and ox gall, and still this mark. So all those things they used to try to get the stain out of the dress, those were typical ways they tried to use to get dresses clean back then. My father will be angry, a fine silk gown spoiled, but it's not my fault. I passed through the town on my way to the market, and somebody threw it, a clod of mud. I saw the boys, but I didn't know which. I was walking eyes down as a modest maid should. Then it hit me. I looked up and saw them sniggering, hiding their smiles in their dirty hands. If I told my father, he would see that they all got punished, and maybe I should tell him. But I cannot but think. Only one threw the clod. Only one should be punished. But which? I cannot take the stain from my gown, or the thought from my mind. They very much dislike me, but why? What have I done? With my own soft hands I have given out bread on Lammas Day. From my own purse I give to the poor, and in times of war those selfsame boys would scurry like rats to hide themselves in my father's walls. And so our little note over here, when she says that she handed out bread on Lammas Day and gave money to the poor, it says that the duties of a lady like herself, like Isabelle, included giving alms to poor people and loaves of bread. Lammas was celebrated on August 1st, and later it became a feast day later in the Middle Ages. Yet it is true, she continues, I am better clad and better shod and better fed than those churls. And what if I am? My father was chosen to rule the same way he chose them to serve. I do but take what they would take, if the Lord God chose to give to them. So Isabelle believes that her social status and the status of those beneath her is all the way that it was determined to be, way before time began. So she believes that her father was chosen to lead. I want to forget the way they laughed. Their smiles were so ugly I almost feared. They were big boys, almost men, and I was alone, except for my maidservant Emmet. Never mind, my lady, she says to me, but I do mind. My gown is spoilt, and never again will I walk through the streets with my eyes cast down. And that's the end of Isabelle's story. So she was very upset that she wasn't looked on the same as other people in society just because she appeared to be richer. And that was just the way it was in the Middle Ages. People were from all different levels of society, and sometimes they didn't get along. And sometimes they did, just like nowadays. And I have one more story to read you. And this is from Will the Plowboy. So a plowboy is a farmer. He plows the fields with his family, and that's where they get all their food from. So let's hear what he has to say. Wheat, barley, and fallow, that's what my father taught me. If you've got 3 fields, you sow wheat in October and barley in March, and let the 3rd field rest. I don't know why the fields have the right to rest when people don't. I only know that's what he told me. My father has been gone for 4 years now, but I think of him every day. I used to lead the ox when he plowed. We'd finish the field on the north side of the village and cross to the west. But that was a long walk, and he'd let me ride the ox. And then the Lord gave us a strip in the low field, and that was so far it took half the day to get there. And I could not keep up. And neither could my father. There was so much walking between those fields, and the strips of land were so small, our harvest wasn't worth a rotten apple. And then there was the work he had to do in the Lord's fields, the work he was paid to do. Every day he'd bring home 3 herrings and a loaf of bread, but sometimes the herrings had even been gone so long we couldn't eat them. But one night, my father came home late, and my mother ran out and put her arms around him. And I heard her say, "Why, what's that?" And he put his hand over her mouth and led her inside. And under his smock, he had a hair almost as big as a fox. Still warm. My mother cried, and she said he'd be in trouble, and he told her to clean the hair for supper. So we had fresh meat, and I ate so much that I was sick in the night. He said I couldn't tell anyone, not ever, because that hare, or the rabbit, belonged to the Lord, and we had no right to eat it. And I never did tell, and no one found out. And when he was gone, before he left, he told me to work hard and take care of my mother and sisters. And I promised I would. Even if I died of working, I always did everything he told me, and I always will, so long as I live. So that was a very interesting story that Will had to tell. They were so excited to get a fresh rabbit to eat. And why do you think that is? Well, first of all, it would have gotten them into a lot of trouble because all of the animals on the land that they were living on, the lord of the land, the one that owned the land, thought that he had control of all those animals, so they were not allowed to eat them. But Will's father managed to get one, and it was a rare treat for them to have it. It was full of nutrients. They worked hard to get it. That's why it was such a special treat. And a lot of the food back then was very different from what we eat today. They didn't have fast food restaurants or grocery stores that they could just go to get their food. They had to either grow it from the land or go to the marketplace to get it, which would take all day. And they had to grow enough throughout the summer to last throughout the winter. They would salt their meats and dry their food so that they could last throughout the cold months when the fields didn't produce anything. And they typically ate things like lentils, peas, and apples, and beans, oats, and a lot of pork. And they even had milk and cheese like we now have today. Perhaps it wasn't quite the same, though, that you have today. And they would eat it out of dishes like this, often made of wood or some kind of metal. So they didn't have the paper plates that we have today or the plastic plates. They ate out of things that they could make themselves. But a lot of the food back then was very flavorless and bland and kind of boring because they didn't have a lot of ways to spice it up or flavors to add. They had to use what they had in their house. It was very expensive to buy spices. But a lot of medieval kitchens, a lot of kitchens in the Middle Ages had a spice mix that I'm going to show you how to make today. And they would toss a pinch of that in everything from soups to meats to porridges to desserts even. It was kind of a use-all spice seasoning. So I can show you how to make it now. And it starts off with some whole peppercorns, which I'm going to pour into my, what we call a mortar and pestle here, so that I can grind them up. And see, even making your own spices was hard back then. There was a lot of hard work. And actually, this spice mixture has a special name. It was called poudre douce, which is French for sweet or soft powder. Whew, that is strong. And you can see that I ground up the peppercorns there. They're no longer whole. And then we're going to add our other ingredients to it. So right here I have some ginger. We're going to take a pinch of that. And then some cinnamon. Pinch of that and put it in. And then we have some cloves. Now keep in mind, all of these spices were very expensive back then. So they had to make a little bit go a long way. We also have some nutmeg. And last but not least, just a pinch of sugar. And that is why this is called poudre douce, the sweet part or the soft part, because it has the sugar added in, which means it's not as powerful as it would be if it didn't have the sugar. And let me just mix it up. Whew, that smells very strong. It smells good, but it's strong. As you can see, it's all mixed together now. And they would save this in a sealed container of some sort to last for a very long time. And they would just sprinkle it in all of their different dishes to give it some flavor. And there was another spice mix called poudre forte, which means strong powder. And that had a little bit more pepper in it and not the sugar. So that was for those who liked a little bit stronger flavors, a little bit more bitter flavors, and spicier flavors. And of course, there was always salt that they added to food too, but once again, salt was very expensive, so they added it sparingly. But if all else failed, they could always add salt to give a little bit of flavor to their food. And in fact, like I had mentioned before, that's what they put on their meats to make them last throughout the winter. So if you want to make this at home, it's very easy. Once again, it's just pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and sugar if you want. And just mix it all together and seal it up. It's kind of like a medieval version of pumpkin spice. You can put it on pretty much anything. So I encourage you to make it at home. It's very tasty. So I hope you learned quite a bit about the Middle Ages today. And that is it. We will see you next time for another History Hullabaloo. Bye.